August 25, 1944. A pale moon glimmers over northern France. The countryside trembles under a constant rhythmic growl, engines, thousands of them, stretching to the horizon. Convoys roll through the night, headlights dimmed under blackout orders, their cargo more decisive than bullets, fuel. The air tastes of dust and exhaust. Soldiers hunch over steering wheels, eyes burning from fatigue, hands blistered from gear shifts that haven't cooled in days. They drive without pause, through villages still smouldering from retreating Germans, through fields that weeks ago were battlefields. Every hour matters. Ahead, George S. Patton's tanks stand silent, their turrets idle, waiting for this lifeline of motion. Far to the east, German officers in a commandeered farmhouse chuckle at Allied chaos. They believe the Americans, spoiled by abundance, will soon grind to a halt. They have the machines, one sneers, but no discipline, no logistics. By dawn, the laughter will fade. The roads of France are about to become the arteries of a machine no army had ever seen before, the Red Ball Express. By the end of July 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a new and unpredictable phase. The Allies had broken free from the hedgerows of Normandy. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, shattered German defences near Saint-Lô and opened a gap that turned containment into pursuit. Within days, the battlefield transformed from a slow, grinding front into a vast, fluid chase across France. General George S. Patton's Third Army was the sharp edge of that pursuit. Activated on August 1, 1944, it was unleashed like a coiled spring. Patton's divisions surged forward at unprecedented speed, often covering 80 to 100 miles in a day. The German Seventh Army, battered and disoriented, fell back in disarray. Town after town fell with almost mechanical rhythm. But beneath the momentum, a silent crisis was building. Every advance consumed mountains of supplies. Gasoline, ammunition, rations, spare parts. All had to cross hundreds of miles of torn French countryside on roads still cratered from bombing. The Allied supply base remained near the beaches of Normandy. Cherbourg had been captured, but its port facilities were wrecked. Antwerp, the great northern port, was still in German hands. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of food, still had to move inland from temporary depots through a labyrinth of roads never designed for industrial war. The logistical burden defied precedent. An armoured division advancing 100 miles required over 300,000 gallons of fuel, daily. Multiply that by Patton's entire Third Army, plus supporting air and ground units, and the problem became staggering. The European theatre required roughly 20,000 tons of supplies each day, but transportation could deliver barely half that. Patton's spearheads were outrunning their lifeline. By early August, the crisis was visible in every forward column. Tanks ran dry before reaching their objectives. Truck convoys broke down from overuse. Mechanics scavenged parts from wrecks to keep others moving. Engineers patched roads by torchlight. Fuel drums were rolled from trucks by hand, siphoned into jerry cans, poured into tanks still warm from combat. Every soldier knew it. The war now depended not on strategy, but on gasoline. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF faced a paradox. Its armies were winning too fast for their own supply chain. The solution had to come immediately, and it had to come from logistics, not tactics. General John C.H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone Comms, was already warning Eisenhower that the front could collapse from lack of transport. At the same time, General Brehon Somervell, architect of the U.S. Army Service Forces, argued that the Americans had the trucks, the men, and the discipline to improvise. What they needed was organization, a rolling artery designed purely for speed. Patton, impatient as ever, refused to slow his ADV. "My men can eat their belts," he said, "but my tank's gotta have gas." Behind him, staff officers scribbled numbers through sleepless nights. Eisenhower's headquarters began drafting an audacious plan, a non-stop convoy route from Normandy's supply depots to the forward depots feeding Patton's advance. The concept drew from America's own industrial instinct, a highway of motion running day and night, carrying nothing but essential cargo at breakneck pace. It would require tens of thousands of drivers, thousands of trucks, and an unprecedented level of coordination between depots, maintenance crews, and military police. In theory, it seemed impossible. In practice, it became the Red Ball Express. By late August, orders were cut. A circular route would connect Normandy to the forward front, roughly 700 miles round trip. The convoys would run continuously day and night, under strict priority rules. Only designated Red Ball vehicles could use the route. Every truck carried fuel, ammunition, or food, nothing else. Within days, vast motor pools were organized. Maintenance battalions overhauled engines and tires. Quartermasters mapped supply depots. Military police painted route signs with bright red circles. The Red Ball drivers, most of them African-American soldiers from service units, were pulled into the operation with almost no notice. As Patton's tanks rumbled toward the Seine, a parallel war began. A war of engines, sweat, and endurance fought not in the headlines but on the roads of France. The lifeline was open, but it was fragile. Every delay, every breakdown, every wrong turn could mean a division without fuel. And while the Germans reeled from defeat, they were watching. Their generals saw the American advance stretching itself thin, and they believed the supply lines would snap. They were wrong. In the last week of August 1944, the Allied armies stood at a crossroads, not of geography, but of endurance. The liberation of Paris was imminent, the German front was collapsing, yet the American advance teetered on exhaustion. Behind the triumphant headlines, the battlefield depended on a single question: could the US Army feed and fuel itself faster than it could fight? On August 25th, Supreme Headquarters authorized the creation of a new logistical lifeline, the Red Ball Express. The name was borrowed from the American railroad term for high-priority freight. It meant urgency, movement without delay. Within 48 hours, the order was operational. What emerged was not just a supply route, it was the largest trucking operation in military history. The route itself began near Saint-Lô, stretching eastward toward Chartres, then splitting toward Reims and Verdun as the front advanced. It covered roughly 700 miles round trip. Military police sealed the highways from civilian use. Only vehicles marked with a red circle could enter, each truck a moving artery in a continuous loop of motion. At its height, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks per day, manned by more than 23,000 drivers and mechanics. Most were African-American soldiers, men from quartermaster truck companies, often relegated to service roles by segregationist policy, now thrust into one of the most dangerous and critical missions of the war. They drove day and night under blackout conditions, following convoys spaced at 60-yard intervals, headlights painted half black to avoid Luftwaffe detection. The schedule was relentless. Each round trip took 54 to 80 hours depending on weather and mechanical strain. Drivers slept beside their vehicles or not at all. Convoys carried everything: fuel drums, artillery shells, rations, medical supplies, replacement parts, anything that kept Patton's and Bradley's armies moving eastward. Maintenance units worked on the roadside, patching tires, welding axles, replacing clutches in open fields. To sustain this tempo, Command introduced a two-lane system, one road for loaded trucks heading to the front, another for empty trucks returning west. Traffic control was absolute. Any unauthorized vehicle entering the Red Ball route faced arrest or impoundment. Time was the enemy. The system's motto was simple: keep 'em rolling. Behind the operational brilliance lay improvisation. Many trucks were worn beyond their limits, their engines long overdue for overhaul. Drivers stripped parts from wrecks to repair others. Fuel shortages forced convoys to siphon from their own cargo. Rations ran thin. Soldiers joked that the Red Ball Express ran on coffee and adrenaline, yet for all its chaos, it worked. In its first week, the Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies to forward depots. By mid-September, it averaged 5,000 tons per day, at times exceeding 10,000. The stream of motion became the pulse of the Allied advance. Patton's Third Army, cut off from railways and dependent entirely on truck convoys, survived only because of that flow. Meanwhile, German intelligence underestimated it. Reports from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht described the American advance as logistically impossible. They assumed the US supply system would collapse within weeks. Instead, each day brought more convoys, more trucks, more fuel, appearing from the west like an endless tide. The Red Ball Express was not just a marvel of logistics, it was also a symbol of human strain and perseverance. Accidents were constant. Fatigue blurred judgment. Drivers crashed into ditches, overturned trucks, and sometimes drove directly into enemy ambushes. More than 40% of all Red Ball vehicles suffered mechanical failure during the campaign. Dozens of drivers were killed on the route, victims of fatigue, accidents, or stray attacks. Still, they drove. Orders came, roads cleared, convoys moved, without pause, without recognition. Patton's tanks reached the Meuse in record time. American columns pushed through Belgium faster than the enemy could react. Every mile forward was written in diesel smoke and engine oil. By September, even German prisoners spoke with disbelief. Captured officers remarked on the speed of US logistics. "You Americans," one said, "fight your war like you run your factories." It was not a compliment, it was surrender to industrial inevitability. But speed had a cost. As the front lengthened into the Lorraine region, fuel convoys stretched thin. Every mile east doubled the strain on supply lines. The roads deteriorated, trucks aged, and maintenance lagged. The Red Ball Express had become indispensable and unsustainable. It could not last forever. Yet before it burned out, it would achieve something no army had ever done. It would turn logistics into a weapon. The Red Ball Express had transformed the map, but the men behind the wheels were still invisible. Their story formed the human core of this mechanized triumph. They were young, mostly under 25. Many had never left the United States before the war. Some had grown up in the cotton fields of the South, others in the crowded streets of Chicago or Detroit. When they enlisted, they expected to cook, clean, or load crates, not to drive through combat zones in the dead of night. Yet these men, from segregated units of the US Army, became the backbone of the Red Ball Express. Out of roughly 23,000 soldiers who manned the convoys, more than 3/4 were African American. The irony was sharp. In an army that separated them by race, they carried the entire Allied advance on their backs. The Red Ball was both their duty and their defiance. They drove 2.5-ton GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, vehicles built for reliability, not comfort. Cabs rattled, gearboxes screamed, windshields cracked from dust and recoil. The men named their trucks after sweethearts, hometowns, and gospel verses. They taped photographs to dashboards and kept Lucky Charms near the throttle. The road was endless, but identity gave rhythm to exhaustion. Every trip was a gamble. Drive. RS faced Luftwaffe strafing runs, minefields, snipers, and ambushes from retreating German units. But fatigue was the greater enemy. Many drove 20 hours straight, eyes half closed, steering by instinct. Convoy discipline meant no stopping, not even for a crash or a breakdown unless ordered. If a truck failed, it was pushed off the road, cargo transferred, and the column kept moving. Time ruled everything. Food was scarce, rest even rarer. They ate cold rations while refueling, drank bitter coffee from dented cans, and slept sitting up against steering wheels. Some used morphine tablets to stay awake. Others sang to themselves in the dark to keep from drifting into sleep. Despite the hardship, morale endured. The men took pride in being the artery that fed the war. "If we don't roll, they don't fight," one driver wrote home. It wasn't boasting, it was truth. In the official press, their work was rarely mentioned. Combat headlines sold newspapers, logistics did not. Yet by September, these convoys were hauling nearly 90% of the fuel consumed by the advancing US armies. Without them, Patton's tanks would have stopped cold in the fields of France. For the drivers, recognition came later, sometimes decades later. But in 1944, they drove for each other. Their pride came from motion. As long as the engine roared, they were part of something larger than the color line, larger than the war itself, the machine of victory. On paper, Patton's Third Army was unstoppable. In reality, its greatest weapon wasn't armor or artillery. It was speed, and speed required fuel. Every Sherman tank consumed about 1 gallon per mile. Every half-track truck and jeep drew from the same reservoir. Fuel wasn't a resource, it was a weaponized currency. By late August 1944, the entire Western Front revolved around fuel logistics. The U.S. Army measured operations not by miles but by gallons. Divisional commanders tracked fuel reports as closely as casualty lists. A delayed convoy could halt an entire corps. A lost truck could mean a silent tank on the battlefield. The Red Ball Express turned this fragility into strength. It converted logistics from a defensive concern into an offensive instrument. The route's design allowed continuous flow, like blood through veins, feeding the armored thrusts that overwhelmed German lines. Every convoy arrival meant another leap forward for the Allied advance. Patton understood this instinctively. His warfare doctrine was built on relentless pressure, keep the enemy moving backward, never let him regroup. The Red Ball made that tempo possible. On some days, Third Army used 350,000 gallons of fuel, on others nearly double. Still, the trucks delivered. Tactically, it changed how the Germans perceived the war. Their generals had built their own blitzkrieg on mechanized momentum, believing no other army could replicate it. They were wrong. The Americans had created a logistical blitzkrieg, a rolling, self-sustaining engine that carried war forward faster than any staff map could predict. Fuel depots became the new battlefields. Instead of fighting for cities, the U.S. Army fought for supply nodes. Military police guarded intersections as fiercely as frontline outposts. Convoy control centers tracked every movement, ensuring no gap in the chain. Still, the system demanded sacrifice. For every armored victory reported in newspapers, hundreds of unseen drivers paid the cost. Engines burned out, transmissions seized, nerves frayed. The tactical brilliance of the Red Ball Express wasn't born from comfort or abundance. It came from exhaustion, turned into momentum. By mid-September, when German resistance stiffened around the Moselle, American commanders realized something profound. Logistics had become strategy. The front line no longer ended at the tanks, it began at the steering wheel. The soldiers of the Red Ball Express weren't following the battle. They were defining its limits. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous. It had no steel treads, no cannon barrels, no sleek silhouettes of warplanes. Its power lay in steel frames, diesel engines, and miles of worn rubber tires. The technology was industrial, not tactical, but it was the kind of technology that wins wars. At the center of it all stood the GMC CCW, the Deuce and a Half. It was the workhorse of the Allied war effort, a 5-ton 6-wheel drive truck capable of hauling almost anything over mud, rubble, or dirt. More than 800,000 of them were built during the war, but in France, their numbers took on new meaning. Each truck became a lifeline. The convoy system relied on coordination rather than communication. There were no GPS units, no satellite relays. Orders moved through field telephones, dispatch riders, and convoy logs scribbled in grease pencils. Navigation was visual. Follow the truck ahead, follow the red circle signs, and never stop unless ordered. Military police marked every turn, every crossing. A missed sign could mean an hour's delay, or a column of tanks stranded without fuel. Every truck was a microcosm of improvisation. Broken drive shafts were replaced with scavenged steel rods. Tires were patched with rubber cut from wrecks. Some drivers added makeshift armor from sandbags or spare plates. They tied ammunition crates to fenders, welded brackets to carry jerry cans, and built sleeping bunks over cargo beds. The trucks aged visibly under strain, their paint coated with dust and oil, their suspensions groaning under impossible loads. Fuel distribution became a science of necessity. Portable fuel depots, pole dumps, were set up every 20 miles. Engineers built temporary bridges from timber and scrap steel to handle constant traffic. When bridges collapsed, bulldozers dug bypasses overnight. The entire system evolved daily, adapting faster than any pre-war logistics manual had imagined. Air superiority helped. Allied fighter bombers patrolled skies above the convoys, deterring German aircraft. But Luftwaffe raiders still struck occasionally, strafing columns, setting trucks ablaze. Drivers learned to space their vehicles and keep moving. A stopped truck was a dead one. Even with such hazards, the efficiency was staggering. By late September, Red Ball trucks had logged nearly 40 million miles. A mechanical feat unmatched in the war, the operation became a living organism, with each depot, truck, and driver functioning as a cell in a single logistical body. Technology, stripped of glory, had become the true engine of strategy. In the mud of France, it wasn't the new inventions that mattered, it was the mastery of movement. In German headquarters, disbelief turned to alarm. Intelligence officers intercepted reports of continuous American convoys pouring through western France. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed roads packed with trucks, columns stretching for miles, all heading east. It was an image the Wehrmacht could not understand. German logistics had relied on railroads, precise timetables, and limited fuel reserves. When the Allies bombed their rail network, their war machines slowed to a crawl. The Americans, by contrast, had created a mobile infrastructure, a railway on wheels, impervious to destroyed bridges or sabotaged tracks. It was an inversion of everything the German staff believed about warfare. General Alfred Jodl, at Hitler's operations staff, dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Ummand believed in delegation, empowering field logistics officers to act without waiting for orders. Patton, obsessed with tempo, demanded results without excuses. He understood that every minute of delay gave the enemy time to regroup. When comms officers warned that the Red Ball system was burning out vehicles faster than replacements could arrive, Patton's reply was simple: then drive them until they die. For all his fury, Patton understood the truth. Momentum is psychological as much as mechanical. The Germans were collapsing, not only from firepower, but from the sight of an army that refused to slow down. Logistics had become a weapon of morale. In private, some German generals admitted envy. General Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg, had once written that the key to modern war was not tanks, but fuel. Now, as the Allies swept across France, that doctrine turned against its creators. The Americans had perfected the same principle, but multiplied it through industrial scale. By the time the German High Command realized what was happening, it was too late. The Red Ball Express had erased the limits of distance. Every new position the Wehrmacht attempted to defend was already within reach of American supply lines. The war of maneuver had become a war of supply, and Germany had already lost it. The laughter that began in August had died by September. In its place came disbelief, the quiet understanding that the Americans, mocked for their excess, had weaponized abundance. The enemy's arrogance had met the American machine, and that machine was still moving east. By early September 1944, the Allied advance had reached its limits, not from enemy resistance, but from the exhaustion of its own success. The Third Army stood near the Moselle River, its vanguard pressing toward Metz. The dream of breaking into Germany before winter seemed possible, but the tanks were silent. Fuel drums sat empty. The offensive that had sprinted across France now idled in place. Patton raged in his headquarters at Nancy. His divisions had fought the Germans to the brink of collapse, but now they waited. Stranded, powerless, and humiliated by barrels that read dry. "My men can eat their belts," he barked, "but my tanks gotta have gas." Every officer knew it. The mightiest army in the world had been halted not by the enemy, but by arithmetic: too many miles, too few gallons. In the rear, the Red Ball Express strained under impossible demand. Convoys thundered eastward from Normandy depots, every truck overloaded beyond regulation. The weather had turned against them. Rain fell in sheets, transforming French roads into slick rivers of mud. Engines groaned, tires sank, and drivers fought the wheel for every mile. Still, they drove. Each truck carried the heartbeat of the advance. 55-gallon drums stacked to the canvas roof, cases of ammunition lashed down with wire. Wooden crates of sea rations wedged beneath tarps. They drove through darkness without lights, engines muffled by weather and fear. When one broke down, the others swerved around it, never stopping. The route had to stay alive. Behind them, the maintenance battalions worked around the clock. Mechanics replaced transmissions under lantern light. Crews stripped wrecks for parts. Fuel depots overflowed, then emptied again within hours. The pace consumed everything: tires, engines, men. But still the front demanded more. German air raids returned, hunting the convoys that had become the arteries of the American advance. Jagdgeschwader squadrons swept in low, their 20mm cannons raking the road. Drivers scattered, trucks burst into flames, smoke choking the sky. Yet within hours, traffic resumed. Nothing stopped the flow for long. The Red Ball Express was no longer a supply route. It was an organism that refused to die. At the front, fuel shortages dictated tactics. Tank units halted, conserving what little remained. Infantry advanced cautiously, their artillery limited short bursts. Patton's commanders sent desperate telegrams rearward, fuel situation critical, immediate resupply essential. Unexpected. Rain turned fields to swamps, tanks bogged down, trucks skidded into ditches. It was logistics against nature. Convoys pushed forward despite collapsing infrastructure. Temporary bridges, built from scrap timber and wreckage, groaned under the weight of loaded trucks. Drivers crossed them in single file, praying each plank would hold. When bridges broke, engineers laid new ones in hours. When trucks sank, axle-deep in mud, bulldozers pulled them free with chains. Enemy attacks came daily. The Luftwaffe, desperate and diminished, strafed roads near Verdun and Troyes. One convoy lost 12 trucks in a single raid. Yet within hours, replacements were already on the road. The Express absorbed losses the way an army absorbs casualties, with relentless replacement and motion. By mid-September, discipline turned into obsession. Drivers began marking their dashboards with the names of routes, distances, and time records. Some bet cigarettes on who could reach the depots fastest. Commanders tried to impose rest cycles, but few obeyed. Pride had taken over. Each man believed that if he stopped, the front would stop with him, and he was right. On the front line, Patton's troops felt the consequences of that devotion. Fuel convoys arrived just in time for assaults that would have otherwise failed. Tanks rolled into position with engines still dripping gasoline from fresh refills. Artillery batteries received ammunition minutes before scheduled bombardments. The entire campaign balanced on the thin edge of timing, and logistics never faltered. Even German intelligence began to acknowledge it. Reports intercepted by Allied cryptographers revealed Wehrmacht officers describing the American supply effort as unbelievable. They noted the endless convoys, the speed of recovery, the apparent disregard for weather and terrain. For the first time in the war, the Germans realized that they were facing not only superior numbers, but superior organization. The psychological effect was enormous. German field commanders, accustomed to fighting armies that slowed when stretched thin, now faced an enemy that accelerated. Every time they destroyed a bridge, it was rebuilt within hours. Every time they believed the Americans would pause to resupply, the tanks arrived anyway, fueled, rearmed, ready to strike. At Metz, the turning point came quietly. Late September, the city's defenders found themselves surrounded and short of ammunition. Patton's forces, sustained by a supply chain that had defied logic, continued their advance. By mid-November, Metz fell. The victory was tactical, but its foundation was logistical. The Red Ball Express had made it possible. In 82 days of continuous operation, it delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to sustain multiple armies across 2 nations. It was a triumph measured not in battles won, but in barrels moved, trucks repaired, and men who refused to stop. When the final convoy returned west for the last time, many of its drivers wept. They were exhausted, uncelebrated, and half forgotten even by their own command. But they knew what they had done. They had built the invisible bridge between Normandy and victory. For the Germans, the lesson was humiliating. Their intelligence reports from November spoke of a war decided by gasoline. The Wehrmacht, once master of mechanized warfare, had been outmaneuvered by its own doctrine, defeated by the very principle it had invented. The Red Ball Express had not just fueled Patton's blitz. It had redefined modern war. Logistics had become the front line. The guns of Metz fell silent, but the rumble of engines in the distance continued. The sound of a new kind of power, born from discipline, motion, and the sheer will to keep going. The war was shifting toward Germany's borders. The question now was how long the Red Ball Express could endure before the winter and the next great trial began. Winter 1944. France was free, but the war was far from over. The Red Ball Express, once the roaring heartbeat of Patton's advance, began to slow. Its trucks, dented, scorched, and worn thin by 82 days of non-stop motion, were collapsing one by one. Engines failed from exhaustion, tires shredded from the endless grind of rough French roads. The The men behind the wheel had driven farther in 3 months than most civilians did in a lifetime. By mid-November, the network that had fed Patton's Third Army was being dismantled. The Allies now controlled functioning ports in Antwerp and Le Havre, making long overland convoys less necessary. The Red Ball Express, born of desperation, was never meant to last. It was a temporary artery keeping the body of the Allied advance alive until permanent supply routes could be established. Its impact went far beyond the numbers. It revealed the soul of an army built on organization and endurance rather than prestige. More than 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers, many of whom had been excluded from combat roles. They served in segregated units, paid less respect, given less recognition. Yet when the front demanded speed, it was these men who kept the war machine alive. In diaries and letters home, they spoke not of heroics, but of exhaustion and purpose. "We hauled gas like blood," one wrote. "You stop, the tanks die. You keep rolling, they keep fighting." That was their war, a race against empty fuel gauges and broken axles. Their commanders noticed. General Eisenhower personally praised the operation, calling it the most vital achievement of the Allied campaign in France. Patton, who often demanded the impossible, admitted that without the Red Ball Express his advance would have stopped before Metz. Behind his tanks, he said, was the finest logistical performance in military history. Even the Germans, stunned by how quickly American forces had recovered from their own success, began studying the Red Ball model. Captured Wehrmacht officers described it as an industrial miracle, comparing its efficiency to Germany's own lost rail system. They had relied on rigid planning and centralized control. The Americans had built a flexible, self-correcting organism that responded to chaos instead of collapsing under it. The toll, however, was brutal. Accidents were constant. Convoys collided in darkness, trucks overturned in ditches, brakes failed on steep descents. More than 200 men were killed or injured during operations. Few received medals. Many names never made it past company records. The army moved on, and their story sank into the archives of logistics reports. Yet the legacy endured in subtle ways. The techniques pioneered by the Red Ball Express, route specialization, rolling maintenance teams, fuel prioritization, night convoy discipline, became the foundation of post-war military logistics. When the U.S. Army later planned operations in Korea and Vietnam, many of its core doctrines traced directly back to that network of mud-covered trucks and sleepless drivers. In France, the evidence of their passage remained visible for years. Villagers remembered the endless lines of olive-drab trucks roaring through at night, their tarpaulins flapping in the wind, their drivers waving tired hands. They remembered the noise, the kind of mechanical thunder that never truly stopped. In some towns, locals still refer to those roads as La Route Américaine. But as the front pushed toward Germany, the Red Ball Express faded quietly into history. The convoys dispersed, the drivers reassigned. Many returned home to a country that still refused them equal recognition. For them, victory was both shared and distant. They had powered the liberation of Europe, yet their names were seldom spoken beside those of generals or aces. Still, their achievement had rewritten the logic of modern war. Logistics, once a supporting act, had become the decisive weapon. The road itself had become a battlefield, and as Allied forces advanced toward the Rhine, new challenges rose ahead: colder weather, longer supply lines, and the last desperate counterattack Germany would ever launch. December 1944. Snow blanketed the French countryside, muffling the noise of war. The Red Ball Express had officially shut down, but its legacy remained alive in the thousands of trucks now reassigned to new routes, supporting the Allied advance into Belgium and Luxembourg. The war had entered its final brutal phase, and once again, logistics became destiny. The Battle of the Bulge struck like a storm. German forces, in one last desperate gamble, launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, and fuel shortages threatened to stall the counterattack before it began. But the memory of the Red Ball Express lingered, its systems, its discipline, its relentless motion. Within days, new convoy operations were organized, unofficially called Red Ball II by the soldiers who had once driven the original routes. These hastily revived lines became critical to sustaining the defense at Bastogne and the eventual counterstrike. Many of the same African-American drivers who had once kept Patton's advance alive now found themselves braving icy roads under artillery fire. They delivered fuel that allowed Patton's tanks to swing north and relieve the encircled American 101st Airborne Division. The Red Ball Express had been disbanded on paper, but in spirit, it had never stopped. By early 1945, the Allies were across the Rhine. The mechanized juggernaut that had begun on Normandy's beaches now stood at the gates of Germany. Every inch of that advance had been paved by logistics, by men who had learned through exhaustion and perseverance that war was not only about courage in battle, but endurance in motion. The statistics told a quiet truth. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express had carried over 400,000 tons of supplies across France. Its trucks had covered more than 25 million miles. Yet numbers could not measure the strain or the unity it forged among men who had nothing in common but duty. After the war, historians would struggle to give the Red Ball Express its due place in the story of victory. Combat made heroes visible, logistics made victory possible, and in the hierarchy of remembrance, visibility always won. It would take decades, and the testimonies of surviving drivers, for the public to understand that the liberation of Europe ran not just on courage and tactics, but on diesel and wheels. The legacy of the Express outlived its era. In 1949, the newly independent U.S. Army Transportation Corps adopted many of its methods as doctrine. Military academies began teaching the operation as a model of adaptive supply under pressure. When NATO was formed, its logistics systems drew directly from the lessons of 1944. Redundancy, speed, flexibility, and the principle that supply lines were not the rear, but the spine of modern warfare. Even civilian industries borrowed from it. Long-haul trucking companies in post-war America studied Red Ball route structures to build their national networks. In that sense, every modern supply chain, every highway freight corridor, carries a faint echo of those convoys thundering through France. For the men who lived it, the experience never faded. Many had joined the war to prove themselves in a segregated army that doubted their worth. They returned as veterans of the most effective logistical operation in history. They had shown the world, and their own nation, that competence, courage, and endurance knew no color. Their reward was quiet dignity. Some found work as mechanics or drivers in post-war America, others faded into anonymity. But their achievement endured, carved not in marble or medals, but in the unbroken line of trucks that once connected the beaches of Normandy to the walls of Metz. By the spring of 1945, as the Allies crossed into Germany and the Reich began to collapse, the war had changed shape. Battles were still fought by men with rifles and tanks, but victory now moved on wheels, and every wheel turned because of what the Red Ball Express had proven possible. Its rumble faded into history, but the idea embodied never did, that war, at its core, is sustained not only by those who fight, but by those who keep it moving. The engines had gone silent, but their echo would fuel every war, every convoy, every victory that came after. The Red Ball Express was more than a logistical operation. It was proof that victory in modern war depends not on who fires first, but on who keeps moving longest. It transformed trucks and drivers into the arteries of a living army, turning supply into strategy and endurance into dominance. Historians often speak of great generals, Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, but behind every decision they made stood a network of men who carried their orders into reality, mile by mile, through rain and darkness. They weren't celebrated on posters or immortalized in battle footage. They were anonymous hands on steel wheels, keeping the front alive. In their motion lay a new philosophy of war. The Red Ball Express revealed that the line between heroism and exhaustion is razor thin, and that the true measure of strength is not found in aggression, but in sustainment. It was a war of fuel, rubber, and determination, a triumph of organization as profound as any military victory. The laughter of those German generals, once certain of American inefficiency, became the sound of their own defeat. They had underestimated not just American industry, but American will, the capacity to improvise, to adapt, and to move without pause. The roads of France are quiet now. The fields have healed, the wreckage long cleared. But beneath the silence lies the memory of engines that once refused to stop. The Red Ball Express remains a monument not built of stone or bronze, but of dust, fuel, and resolve. Every convoy that followed, from Korea to Iraq, carried its legacy forward. Every soldier who understood that victory depends on supply walked in the tire tracks of those 6,000 trucks. In the end, the Red Ball Express was not just the story of how Patton's army advanced. It was the story of how an army learned to sustain itself, how a generation turned motion into power, and how the road itself became the battlefield. The war ended in 1945, but the lesson of 1944, that logistics win wars, never has